The year was 1950, and the small fishing village of Portlock, Alaska, seemed like the perfect blend of isolation and opportunity. Its location, tucked between the dense forests and the roaring sea, was both breathtaking and treacherous. Residents lived in tune with the wilderness, respecting its power but thriving on its resources. However, whispers of the unsettling began to grow louder. One crisp fall morning, Jack Harmon, a well-known trapper in the village, set out early with his dog Charlie. Jack had lived in Portlock all his life, a quiet man whose knowledge of the woods was unmatched. By noon, when Jack didn't return home for lunch as promised, his wife Linda started to worry. It wasn't like Jack to lose track of time. The hours dragged, and soon neighbors gathered to help search the woods. The dense spruce trees swallowed their shouts, the forest unusually silent except for the occasional gust of wind. By sundown, the search party stumbled upon something horrifying. A tattered piece of Jack's coat snagged on a jagged branch, and nearby, a smattering of blood against the mossy ground. No body, no tracks, just silence. The disappearance wasn't the first. Elijah Tritt, a logger, had vanished weeks prior under similar circumstances, but most in the village had chalked it up to carelessness in the wild. Now, 2 men gone within a month was too much to ignore. That night, the village council held a meeting at the tiny schoolhouse. The chatter was nervous, escalating to outright panic as they shared other eerie stories. Strange howls heard in the night, the mangled remains of livestock found at the edge of the woods, and shadows darting between trees just beyond sight. "Something's hunting us," an older man, Henry McAllister, said grimly, his voice trembling. "And it's not a bear." The room fell silent. They all had the same fear but were too scared to say it aloud. Bears didn't hunt men. Wolves wouldn't dare attack a village. Yet there was something in those woods, something angry, something patient. By dawn, a small group of men, armed with rifles and led by Henry, ventured deep into the forest, determined to uncover the truth or recover Jack's body. They never spoke of what they found when they returned. All anyone knew was that they looked different. Pale, shaken, their hands trembling as they locked their doors that night. When pressed for details, Henry finally muttered, "It's not safe here anymore." But no one left Portlock. Not yet. The days following Jack Harmon's disappearance were suffocating with unease. The once vibrant village had fallen silent, save for the restless crashing of waves against the rocky shore. Families kept their children indoors, doors were bolted by sundown, and even the hardiest fishermen stayed within the bay's safer waters. Whatever lurked in the woods had claimed more than lives. It had stolen Portlock's peace. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dense forest, the first shriek was heard. It began faintly, distant but unmistakable, a bone-chilling scream that cut through the rustle of trees and the crashing surf. Emma Calloway, a widow who lived at the edge of the village, froze in her chair as she knit by the fire. Her hands trembled as she gripped the armrest, listening. Then it came again, louder this time, echoing through the hills, a sound unlike any creature she'd ever known. "God save us," she whispered, locking her door. By morning, another tragedy struck. Thomas Grover, a logger, hadn't come home the night before. A search party, now dwindling in numbers due to growing fear, ventured cautiously into the woods. What they found chilled even the most rugged men to their core. Thomas's remains, or what was left of them, scattered in a grisly radius across the mossy floor. His tools, bloodied and broken, lay meters apart as if flung with unimaginable force. In the center of the carnage, something worse awaited. Deep in the earth were claw marks, deep, wide gashes that couldn't have been made by any known predator. The men returned pale and silent, refusing to speak of the horrors they'd witnessed. That evening, as the village gathered for another council meeting, the tension was palpable. Margaret Tritt, widow of Elijah Tritt, rose to speak. Her voice wavered, but there was anger in her eyes. "How many more of our men must die?" she demanded, glaring at the council members. "We've lost Elijah, Jack, and now Thomas, and all we do is sit and whisper." "Leave, then," came a voice from the back. It was John Carter, a burly fisherman known for his pragmatism. "No one's forcing you to stay." Margaret's response was sharp. "You think leaving is easy? My entire life is here. My children's lives are here. You won't have lives if you stay." John shot back, his tone grim. It was Henry McAllister who quieted the room, his voice low but firm. Leaving isn't the answer. Whatever this is, it will only follow. We must face it together. But what was it? No one dared give it a name. That night, Henry organized a watch. Men armed with rifles took shifts patrolling the village's perimeter, fires burning brightly at key points to keep the shadows at bay. For 2 nights, it seemed to work. No shrieks, no disappearances. Confidence began to creep back into the village. Maybe it had been an unusually aggressive bear after all. Then came the 3rd night. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting a pale glow over the sleeping village. It was Peter Lorne's shift, a younger man eager to prove himself. He stood near the eastern edge of the forest, gripping his rifle tightly, the firelight dancing in his anxious eyes. A branch snapped. Peter froze, his heart pounding as he scanned the tree line. "Hello," he called out, his voice cracking. There was no answer, only the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then he saw it. A pair of eyes, low to the ground and glowing faintly in the darkness. "Bear," he whispered to himself, though doubt crept into his voice. Slowly, Peter raised his rifle, aiming for the glow. His hands trembled as he tightened his grip. The eyes blinked, and in an instant they weren't low anymore. Whatever it was rose, standing unnaturally tall, its silhouette barely visible in the shadows. Peter's scream shattered the stillness of the night, followed by a single gunshot. By the time the other watchman reached his position, Peter was gone. His rifle lay snapped in 2, the ground beneath it soaked with blood. In the distance, the howls began again, louder and closer than ever before. Something had been unleashed, and now it wasn't just hunting in the woods, it was coming for the village. By the time dawn broke over Portlock, the village was paralyzed with fear. The watchman who found Peter Lorne's broken rifle had returned shaken, speaking in hushed tones about the blood trail leading into the forest. No one dared to follow it. The council met again that morning, the schoolhouse packed with villagers desperate for answers. Whispers filled the room until Henry McAllister stood, slamming his fist on the podium to silence them. "Enough," he barked, his voice cutting through the panic. "This isn't helping. We need a plan. Running won't solve anything." "But staying here is suicide," shouted Caleb Moss, a fisherman gripping his hat like a lifeline. "Whatever's out there won't stop. It's already taken 4 of us." A heavy silence hung in the air until Margaret Tritt stepped forward. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, but there was a fire in her voice. "We can't fight what we don't understand. Someone needs to find out what we're dealing with." "You're suggesting we go into the woods?" Caleb scoffed. "That's madness." "It's our only chance," Margaret shot back. "If we don't figure out what's out there, none of us will survive." The room erupted into heated debate, fear and desperation twisting every word. In the end, it was Henry who decided. "I'll go," he said firmly, his gaze steady. "If anyone else has the courage, join me. The rest of you prepare to leave if we don't return." By midday, a group of 4 set out. Henry, Margaret, Bill Carter, John's younger brother and a skilled hunter, and Father O'Connell, the village's priest, who insisted on coming to offer spiritual protection. Armed with rifles and an uneasy resolve, they ventured into the forest. The woods were oppressive, the towering spruce trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick moss underfoot. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent their hearts racing. "Over here," Bill called out, kneeling by a patch of disturbed earth. The ground was torn apart, deep grooves slicing through the soil, as though something massive had clawed its way through. The scent of decay hung in the air. "Do you think it's a bear?" Father O'Connell asked, clutching his crucifix tightly. Henry shook his head. "No bear does this." They pressed on, the forest growing denser and darker. Hours passed, and the tension among them grew unbearable. Just as they were about to turn back, Margaret froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The group stilled, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then it came, a low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground. It came from ahead, where the trees clustered tightly together, forming a near impenetrable wall of darkness. Henry motioned for silence and raised his rifle. Slowly, they crept toward the sound. The growl grew louder, accompanied by a wet, tearing noise that made Margaret's stomach churn. When they finally reached a clearing, what they saw turned their blood to ice. A massive creature hunched over something on the ground. Its form was monstrous, part man, part beast, with matted fur and impossibly long limbs. Its hands, or claws, worked feverishly, tearing into what looked like the remains of an animal. The stench was overwhelming. Margaret gasped, and the creature's head snapped up, its glowing eyes locking onto them. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with an ear-splitting roar, the creature charged. "Run!" Henry shouted, firing his rifle. The shot echoed through the forest, but the creature barely flinched. The group scattered, darting through the trees as the beast gave chase. Back in the village, the eerie calm was shattered by the sound of gunfire echoing through the hills. Families huddled together, praying for the safety of the search party. When the gunshots stopped, the silence was deafening. Hours later, as dusk began to fall, a single figure emerged from the woods. It was Margaret, her face streaked with blood and her clothes torn. She stumbled into the village square, collapsing to her knees. "Where are the others?" someone cried, rushing to her side. Margaret looked up, her eyes hollow with terror. "Gone," she whispered. It's not human." The villagers didn't wait for dawn. By midnight, a mass exodus began. Families loaded what they could onto boats and carts, leaving behind their homes and livelihoods. The fear was too great, the memories too fresh. But Margaret didn't leave. She sat at the edge of the dock, staring out at the dark waters, her mind replaying the horrors she had witnessed. The beast was still out there, she knew, waiting in the woods. And it wasn't done. The village of Portlock stood empty. By the light of dawn, the last of the villagers had departed, their boats fading into the misty horizon, leaving behind a place that had once been filled with laughter, the smell of smoked fish, and the rhythm of hammers on wood. Now it was silent, a ghost town shrouded in the oppressive weight of fear. But not everyone had left. Margaret Tritt had refused to board the boats. Even as the others pleaded, her resolve was unshakable. "I won't run," she had said, her voice steady but hollow, "until I understand." In her heart, she knew she couldn't leave the woods' mysteries unanswered. Not after seeing what had taken Henry and the others. As the boats disappeared over the horizon, Margaret walked back into the heart of the abandoned village, the only sound her footsteps on the creaking wooden docks. Margaret knew the danger of staying alone. Her rifle was slung over her shoulder, a small pack filled with provisions on her back, and a lantern in her hand. The daylight was thin, filtered weakly through heavy gray clouds, but she didn't plan to wait for nightfall. She was going back into the forest. As she approached the edge of the tree line, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. Memories of the creature, its monstrous form hunched over its kill, flooded her mind. But she pushed forward, each step heavier than the last. The woods welcomed her with a suffocating stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Margaret followed the trail she had taken with Henry and the others, her eyes scanning the ground for any signs they may have left behind. Bloodstains here, a broken branch there. Every clue made her stomach churn, but she pressed on, deeper and deeper into the shadowed heart of the forest. Hours passed. The sun sank lower, and the shadows stretched longer. Margaret's legs ached and her breath came in sharp bursts, but she refused to stop. Finally, she came to the clearing, the place where it had happened. The stench of decay hit her first, thick and cloying, clinging to the back of her throat. She raised her lantern, the golden light illuminating the grisly scene. Remnants of bones were scattered across the ground, stripped clean and glistening. Deep gashes marked the trees, their bark shredded as though by impossibly large claws. Margaret knelt, her fingers trembling as she picked up a fragment of fabric, a piece of Henry's shirt. Tears welled in her eyes, but before she could grieve, the forest came alive around her. The first sound was a low growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate the air. Margaret froze, her hand tightening on the rifle. Slowly, she rose to her feet, every nerve screaming for her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The growl grew louder, joined by the snapping of branches and the crunch of leaves. Then she saw it. Emerging from the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on her, was the creature. It was even larger than she remembered, its fur matted and streaked with blood, its massive claws glinting in the lantern's flickering light. Margaret didn't think. She fired. The rifle's crack echoed through the clearing, but the beast barely flinched. It roared, the sound deafening and charged. Margaret turned and ran, the lantern swinging wildly in her hand, casting chaotic shadows as she plunged through the trees. Branches tore at her face and clothes, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, the creature crashed through the underbrush, its guttural growls growing closer. She could feel it, a suffocating presence bearing down on her. Her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard, the lantern shattering as it hit the ground. Darkness enveloped her, and for a terrifying moment, all was silent. Then came the sound of heavy breathing just behind her. Margaret scrambled to her feet, fumbling for her rifle. She turned, her finger on the trigger, but the creature was gone. The forest was silent again, save for her panicked breaths. Stumbling blindly through the darkness, Margaret eventually came across a small cabin, its roof sagging and its windows boarded up. She pushed the door open, collapsing onto the floor, her body shaking with exhaustion and terror. The cabin smelled of mildew and rot, but it was shelter. Margaret barricaded the door with an old chair and collapsed against the wall, clutching her rifle like a lifeline. She didn't dare light another lantern, afraid of drawing the creature's attention. Hours passed in darkness, every creak of the cabin and rustle of the forest outside setting her on edge. Sleep was impossible. She replayed the events in her mind, searching for answers. What was this creature? Why was it hunting them? And most importantly, how could she stop it? As dawn broke, a faint light seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls. Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself. She wasn't done yet. If she couldn't kill the creature, she could at least uncover the truth. Somewhere in the woods, she believed, lay the answers. And she would find them, even if it meant confronting the beast again. Morning brought little comfort to Margaret as she emerged from the dilapidated cabin. The faint light revealed the desolation of the forest, where the air seemed heavier and the silence more oppressive than ever. Her body ached, her mind raced, but her resolve was unshaken. Whatever was stalking these woods, whatever had driven the village to abandon their home, she would uncover it, or die trying. Margaret recalled stories from her youth, whispered by elders around fires on long winter nights. They spoke of a devil's pass, a treacherous trail deep in the forest where hunters would vanish, and strange symbols were said to mark the trees. The elders had warned the villagers to steer clear, saying the pass belonged to something ancient and angry. Most dismissed the tales as folklore meant to frighten children. But now, after everything she had seen, Margaret wasn't so sure. Determined, she searched for signs of the pass. The terrain grew more hostile as she pushed deeper. The trees gnarled and bent as if twisted by some unseen force. Hours passed before she found it, a narrow, overgrown path barely discernible beneath the underbrush. Carved into the bark of a tree at its entrance was a crude symbol, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward. Margaret shivered. It looked like a warning. The path was treacherous, littered with loose stones and roots that seemed to grasp at her boots. The further she went, the darker it became, the canopy above so dense that even the midday sun couldn't penetrate. Then she saw them. More symbols, etched into the trees at irregular intervals. Each was different, some crude and jagged, others intricate and unsettlingly precise. They felt intentional, like messages left for those who dared to wander here. Margaret stopped in her tracks as she came upon a clearing. At its center stood a crude stone altar, weathered and covered in moss, but unmistakably unnatural. Surrounding it were skeletal remains, animals perhaps, but larger than anything she'd expect to find in the woods. Her breath caught as she noticed one skull among the pile that was unmistakably human. She approached the altar cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. On its surface were strange markings, similar to the symbols on the trees but more complex. A chill ran through her as she traced them with her fingers. Suddenly, the forest came alive with noise. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the sound of heavy footsteps closing in fast. Margaret spun around, her rifle at the ready, but the clearing was empty. Then came the growl. It stepped into the clearing, its massive frame dwarfing the trees behind it. Up close, the creature was even more horrifying than Margaret had remembered. Its matted fur was streaked with dark stains, its elongated limbs ending in claws that gleamed like polished steel. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, their gaze piercing through her. But it wasn't just the physical terror of the beast that froze her. It was the intelligence behind its movements. This wasn't a mindless predator. It was watching her, studying her. Margaret fired, the shot ringing out through the clearing. The bullet hit its mark, striking the creature in the shoulder. It roared in pain but didn't fall. Instead, it lunged, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. She dove to the side, rolling to avoid its claws as they slashed through the air where she had stood. Scrambling to her feet, Margaret fired again and again, the recoil bruising her shoulder. Blood sprayed from the creature's wounds, but it barely slowed. As it closed in, Margaret stumbled backward, her foot catching on a root. She fell hard, the rifle slipping from her hands. The creature loomed over her, its massive jaws opening to reveal jagged teeth. Just as Margaret braced for the end, a strange sound filled the clearing, a high-pitched whistle, like wind through a narrow tunnel. The creature stopped, its head jerking toward the source. Margaret followed its gaze and saw movement in the shadows. Figures emerged, humanoid but distorted, their forms cloaked in the same unnatural darkness that seemed to cling to the forest. They moved in unison, their steps eerily silent. The creature snarled, backing away from Margaret as if repelled by the newcomers. The figures advanced, encircling the beast, their movements deliberate and unyielding. For the first time, Margaret saw fear in the creature's glowing eyes. Then, without warning, it bolted, crashing through the trees and disappearing into the forest. The figures did not pursue it. Instead, they turned their attention to Margaret. She froze as they approached, their faces hidden beneath shadowed hoods. One stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth. It extended a hand, its long fingers ending in sharp points. In its palm was an object, a small carved totem bearing the same symbols Margaret had seen on the trees. "What do you want from me?" she managed to whisper, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It simply dropped the totem at her feet and retreated, joining the others as they melted back into the shadows of the forest. Margaret sat there for a long time, staring at the totem. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, its surface cold and unnervingly smooth. She didn't understand what had just happened, but one thing was clear. The beast wasn't the only thing in the woods. Margaret stumbled back to the cabin, her mind racing with fragmented images. The hulking beast, the shadowy figures, and the totem that now sat heavy in her pocket. Her hands trembled as she bolted the door behind her and slumped against the wall, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The forest wasn't just home to a monster. Something older, darker, and more deliberate had its grip on these woods. And now it seemed to have taken notice of her. Margaret retrieved the totem, holding it up to the faint light streaming through the cracked shutters. The carvings were intricate, almost hypnotic, and seemed to shift when she looked at them too long. She turned it over, noticing a deep groove in its base. It was as if it was meant to fit into something. The thought struck her. The altar. The totem wasn't just a token. It was a piece of whatever had been worshipped or imprisoned in this cursed forest. A chill ran down her spine as she realized she had taken it. Did that make her the next target? Margaret didn't have long to dwell on the thought. A loud thud shook the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws raking against the wooden walls. Her heart raced as she grabbed her rifle, her eyes darting to the barricaded door. Another thud, harder this time. Dust rained down from the rafters. Whatever was outside wanted in. Margaret aimed her rifle at the door, her finger on the trigger. "Leave me alone!" she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. The thuds stopped. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Then came the growl, low, guttural, and chillingly close. Margaret's eyes widened as she realized the sound wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the roof. The creature's massive weight shifted above her, the wooden beams creaking under the strain. Margaret backed away, clutching the rifle tightly. Her breath caught as claws tore through the ceiling, peeling back planks like paper. Sunlight streamed through the gaping hole, silhouetting the beast as it peered down at her, its glowing eyes burning with rage. Before she could fire, it lunged, crashing into the cabin with a deafening roar. Margaret dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its claws as they splintered the floorboards. The cabin was chaos, wood splintering, furniture shattering, the air thick with dust and the creature's stench. Margaret fired, the shot grazing the creature's side. It howled in pain, its massive form twisting as it swiped at her. She scrambled to her feet, her hands fumbling for the totem. If this thing was tied to the altar, maybe returning the totem would stop it. She bolted for the door, the creature's roar shaking the walls behind her. The forest blurred around her as she ran, her lungs burning and her legs screaming in protest. The creature was relentless, crashing through the underbrush, its growls echoing in the trees. Every time she thought she had gained some distance, it was there again, closer and faster than seemed possible. Margaret clutched the totem tightly, the groove at its base pressing into her palm. She had no clear plan, only the desperate hope that the altar held the answer. The clearing came into view, the twisted trees parting to reveal the ancient stone structure. Margaret didn't stop to catch her breath. She stumbled to the altar, slamming the totem into the groove with trembling hands. For a moment, nothing happened. The forest was deathly silent, save for the sound of her ragged breathing. Then the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The symbols on the altar glowed faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the deep, resonant hum that filled the air. Margaret stumbled back, watching in awe as the totem sank deeper into the stone, as though being consumed. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and the forest seemed to come alive around her. The creature burst into the clearing, its massive form illuminated by the glow of the altar. But it didn't attack. Instead, it stopped, its glowing eyes fixed on the stone as it let out a furious roar. The shadowy figures appeared again, stepping out from the trees as if summoned. They surrounded the altar, their movements slow and deliberate. Margaret watched, frozen in terror, as they began to chant in a language she didn't recognize. Their voices wove together, an eerie melody that seemed to bend the air itself. The creature howled, clawing at the ground as if trying to resist. But the chanting grew louder, and the light from the altar intensified, enveloping the beast in a blinding glow. Margaret shielded her eyes as the light reached its peak, the chanting reaching a frenzied crescendo. When it finally stopped, the clearing fell silent. The beast was gone, and the altar stood dark and still, as if nothing had happened. The shadowy figures turned to Margaret. One stepped forward, its hand extending toward her. For a moment she thought they might attack, but instead it simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, or perhaps warning. Then, one by one, they disappeared back into the trees. Margaret collapsed to her knees, the weight of what she had witnessed crashing down on her. The forest was quiet again, but she knew the peace wouldn't last. Whatever had been subdued, whatever forces controlled this place, they weren't gone. Not entirely. Margaret limped back to the village as the sun dipped below the horizon. Portlock was as she had left it, empty, desolate, and scarred. But something was different. The air was lighter. The oppressive weight of fear lifted, if only slightly. She stood on the dock, staring out at the empty sea. The beast was gone, but at what cost? The forest had given her no answers, only more questions. She knew one thing for certain. Portlock could never be a home again. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Margaret boarded a small skiff, left behind by the others. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. Behind her, the forest watched, waiting. Margaret drifted away from Portlock, the small skiff gliding over the dark waters, leaving the abandoned village and its cursed forest behind. The night was eerily calm, the stars reflected in the still sea. For the first time in weeks, there were no growls, no howls, no whispers of terror in the wind. But the unease hadn't left her. It clung to her like a shadow, a constant reminder of what she had seen and what she hadn't yet understood. Margaret's journey ended in a neighboring town, a small fishing port where the locals eyed her arrival with suspicion. She looked like a ghost herself, dirty, bruised, and haunted. When she tried to tell her story, her words were met with skepticism. Portlock? An older man scoffed over a cup of steaming coffee at the local diner. Ain't no one been up there in years. Just a bunch of superstitious nonsense keeping folks away. But Margaret knew better. She recounted the disappearances, the beast, and the strange figures. At first, the locals dismissed her as another drifter, spinning tales to earn a free meal. But as she described the altar and the symbols, a few faces darkened. There's an old legend, a fisherman said quietly, leaning across the table. The Tlingit call it the Nantinaq. Not a bear, not a man, something in between. A spirit of vengeance, they say, that haunts the forest. People who see it don't usually live to tell the tale. Margaret leaned in, her voice trembling. I saw it. I fought it. But it's still there. And those figures? They weren't human. The fisherman shook his head grimly. You're lucky to be alive, lady. If the Nantinaq didn't take you, it's because the forest chose not to. For weeks, Margaret tried to return to a semblance of normalcy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter wasn't over. The totem haunted her dreams, its cold surface, its shifting carvings. She'd left it at the altar, but she felt its weight in her mind, as if it had left a piece of itself inside her. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, just a breeze in the corners of her consciousness. But as the days passed, they grew louder, forming words she didn't understand, pulling her attention back toward the forest. One night, as she lay in bed, the whispers turned into a roar. Her ears rang, and her vision blurred. When she came to, she was clutching her rifle, standing at the edge of town with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The pull was undeniable. Something was calling her back. Against her better judgment, Margaret returned to Portlock. The journey was grueling, and every step closer to the village felt like stepping deeper into her own grave. When she arrived, the forest loomed before her, darker and more foreboding than ever. The altar was her destination. She knew the answers were there, but so was the danger. The shadows shifted as she entered the clearing, and the air grew colder. The altar was as she had left it, the totem still embedded in its surface. But as Margaret approached, the ground trembled, and a deep growl rumbled through the trees. It wasn't the Nantinaq this time. From the shadows, the figures emerged again, their cloaks billowing as if caught in an unseen wind. They surrounded the altar, their movements synchronized, their chants rising in that otherworldly language. The symbols on the altar began to glow once more, casting the clearing in an eerie, pulsating light. Margaret raised her rifle, unsure if she was more afraid of the figures or what they might summon. What do you want from me? She demanded, her voice shaking. One of the figures turned to her, its face still obscured. Slowly, it extended a hand toward the totem and then pointed to Margaret. The message was clear. She had been marked. Margaret understood in an instant. The totem wasn't just an object, it was a bond, a tether that tied her to the forest's curse. As long as it remained, she would never truly escape. With trembling hands, she reached for the totem, her fingers brushing against its cold surface. The moment she touched it, the chanting stopped. The forest fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Margaret lifted the totem from the altar. The glow faded, and the figures retreated into the shadows, their forms dissolving into the darkness. But the forest was still alive, its presence pressing against her like a heavy fog. You want it? She shouted into the void, holding the totem high. Take it. With all her strength, she hurled the totem into the forest. It disappeared into the shadows, and for a moment everything was still. Then came the roar, a deafening guttural sound that shook the ground. The forest seemed to shudder, and Margaret fell to her knees. When she opened her eyes, the clearing was empty. The symbols on the altar were gone, the air lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. The curse had been severed. Margaret left Portlock for the final time, never looking back. The forest had released her, but she knew it wasn't truly gone. The Nantinaq, the figures, the ancient power that had dwelled there for centuries, they would always linger, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to venture too far. Years later, Margaret's story became a legend, passed down in hushed whispers among the few who dared speak of Portlock. Some believed her, others didn't, but no one returned to the village. And the forest remained, silent and watching, its secrets buried but never forgotten. The end.